Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Thursday, January 25th. Since we last spoke on last week's episode, Indiana obviously suffered a disappointing loss at Wisconsin, although not totally unsurprising given the program's history at the Kohl Center. This week on Podcast on the Brink, excited to be joined by Galen Clavio of CrimsonCast, who I like to call the godfather of IU podcasting. I'll never stop introducing him as that. Welcome back to the show, Galen. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Alex. It's always a pleasure to be on. I appreciate it.
So I kind of feel like, this is a chance, at least for Indiana basketball, to have a bit of a reset with this lengthy break that they have, kind of rare in season to see a whole week without a game. Indiana actually has another one of these breaks coming up in February. So 2 weeks within the season with no games. And obviously Khalil Ware's absence at Wisconsin wasn't a huge factor in the outcome, but maybe somewhat of a setback for Indiana. I know the Hoosiers are hoping to get him healthy in time for Saturday's game in Illinois, but just big picture this week for Indiana of work and preparation, being able to kind of get back to practice. As you sit down to watch Saturday's game, are there 2 or 3 things that you'll be looking for just to kind of see, were these things addressed? Were these things worked on? Are there tangible things that we're going to be able to maybe point to? Obviously, I don't think most people are expecting the Indiana to go in and win this game, but I think people kind of want to see progress. And when you have this type of time off, I don't think it's unfair to expect that the team would improve in some way.
No, I agree. I think what I'll be looking for on Saturday is kind of a combination of the following things. First of all, I just want to see more consistent energy and effort by this team defensively. I think the thing that stands out to me when Indiana's played a lot of their opponents in the Big Ten is that, yes, there are moments when Indiana is high intensity and really making it hard on whoever they're playing, and then those go away. And suddenly it becomes very easy to score on Indiana. And that, to me, is a sign of a team that hasn't quite figured out that you have to play hard all the time. And that's to some degree understandable, given you've got relatively younger players. But it also feels more systemic because it occasionally happens with the upperclassmen as well. And so, I think there just needs to be a greater core purpose. We all look back at that Kansas game, and it really felt like for the majority of that game, Indiana played hard. They didn't always make the plays they had to make, but it was hard to fault the effort. I think you can fault the effort in some of the other games that they've played, and that's going to be the difference for them, I think, the rest of the season in some of these close margin games. The second thing is there has to be a bit more flexibility in terms of how they're approaching offensively. I think everybody freaked out when you have Khalil Ware sitting out against Wisconsin and, we're just going to plug Peyton Sparks in. And it's like, at some point, this is not working. I mean, you have, at this point, the 104th most efficient offense in the country. And while that's gotten marginally better than earlier in the season, it's still bad. And you're getting kind of Herculean efforts out of Malik Renew when he's out there. And then you're rolling the dice on anybody else being able to consistently contribute throughout the course of the game. When you see Mackenzie Mbako and the way that he's developed offensively and the fact that he's not more of a focal point of the offense, despite that, when you add in the lack of guard contributions offensively, especially from the point guard position, I just wonder, why does Indiana schematically keep banging their head against the same wall over and over again, expecting different results? This is you're 20 games into the season essentially at this point. But all that said, I mean, look, I think I said this when I was talking to Jared the other day on our podcast. When teams continually show you who they are, after a while, you have to believe them. And it just feels like this is a team that, yes, they can beat the Marylands, or at least the November, early December version of Maryland. Maryland's looking pretty good these days. They can beat the Michigans. They can beat the Minnesotas at home. And that might be just where they are. They may just be one of those teams that, instead of fighting for an NCAA berth, is instead just fighting to not be in one of the first 2 games of the Big Ten tournament. That's disappointing. But at this point, I'd be more surprised if they weren't, a seeded 11th or worse, given their trend of play. That might sound harsh, but everybody in the Big Ten's playing pretty well right now, except for Penn State. And there's not a lot of teams on Indiana's schedule the rest of the way that I'd look at and say, yeah, I absolutely expect Indiana will be the better team on that night, even in some of the home games.
So going into the season, I think I picked Indiana 7th in the Big Ten. I actually caught some heat from Indiana fans for picking them that low. In retrospect, maybe that was, obviously a little too high based on kind of where this season is trending. Looking at just kind of where this team is, compared to expectations that you had on them, are things like what maybe hasn't developed that you thought would develop, and is this really far off from what you thought it would be, or is this in kind of within the realm of possibilities of what you thought might be able to happen?
No, I was way too optimistic about the way that this team was going to come together. I really felt that last year had established kind of a cultural center for IU basketball coming, off of that second year. And it felt like Woodson had really, finally gotten the players to play pretty consistently well. Yeah, they were going to miss the senior leadership, but they had so much younger talent. They had experience at the guard position that felt like, we had seen it work in the Big Ten. Yeah, so I thought that they had an outside shot at finishing 4th in the conference, and that they were going to be right up there, that, the offensive threat they were going to have down low combined with, intelligent play on the perimeter was going to be a really difficult combination. And I really felt like the defense was going to take a major leap forward, because I think, and a lot of people talked about this last year, I think a lot of people felt like perhaps Indiana's struggles on defense last year were because Trace Jackson Davis, oftentimes he was acting more as like a secondary rim protector than a primary defender. He was needing to stay on the court because he was so important offensively, which made it that he was not as aggressive with playing defense. I think a lot of people assumed that with that not being the case, and with an extra post player of size, Indiana was going to be great around the rim defensively. They were going to grab a lot of rebounds, and none of those things have happened. And so to me, it's been just this systems failure where none of the pieces that I thought were going to get better have actually gotten better, and a lot of them have actually gotten worse. And so, I've on the podcast the last couple of weeks, I've just been like, look, I was wrong about the direction that this was going. I don't regret the ideas that I had at the beginning of the season, because on paper they made a lot of sense. But there's just something intangible missing from this team, where they just don't feel aligned with each other. And you add to that a game plan offensively that just doesn't seem to resonate in today's basketball. And it's kind of ended up being the worst case scenario, I think.
So, we've talked a lot about, at least on this show, and I know you guys have probably talked about this over the course of the season, and maybe even going back to previous seasons under Woodson, just kind of this, I don't want to call it antiquated, but it's an older style of basketball in terms of not emphasizing the 3-point shot. And really, Woodson talked the first 2 seasons about playing through the post because he had Trace Jackson Davis, and that was kind of what he had to do based on the personnel. And then now it's season 3, and it's kind of the same thing, where this team is built primarily around 2 big men offensively and what they want to do. Do you feel like this is something that, for Woodson to maybe reach the ceiling that people thought he could reach after his first 2 seasons, it's going to have to be changed moving forward? Or do you think there is a world where you can succeed playing this style of basketball and with the low 3-point shooting volume?
I think you can win sufficiently with this style, but you can't win sufficiently with this style if you're not going to get offensive rebounds. Like, you can be post-centered, you can even have a lower effective field goal percentage. Indiana's not as good from 2 this year as they were last year. But you can't have this type of offense where you're centering it around the post and just abandon the offensive glass, which is essentially what Indiana's done. Now, offensive rebounds have never been that big of a thing under Mike Woodson. It's never been a key component of the 4 factors offensively. But what I find like really disappointing about this season is you have what looks like on paper the perfect lineup to just abuse the offensive glass. You've got three guys over 6'8", all of whom are pretty athletic, and none of them look to rebound the ball. I don't blame Malik Renew as much because they've had to turn him essentially into a primary distributor of the basketball. Like he's essentially become a post creator because they're just not getting that out of their guards. Trey Galloway's been better at it lately, and they have made an adjustment there. But even with that adjustment, Indiana's offensive rebounding percentage is among like the lowest percentages in the country, especially among Power 5 teams. So if you're going to forsake the 3-point line with the efficiency that's baked into that, and you're going to take a lot of twos, you either have to hit a lot of free throws or you have to get a lot of offensive rebounds, or ideally both. And Indiana does neither. They get to the free throw line a ton, but they don't convert the free throws that they're shooting. I mean, I'm surprised we haven't heard more about that. I mean, Indiana right now is shooting 66.4% from the free throw line, which that is, if that stands, that's the worst mark since Archie Miller's second year. And you remember how much everybody loved Archie Miller shooting percentage numbers. So, I think a lot about this offense can work if you have the right personnel in place that are playing hard and you're valuing the proper things. It just doesn't. And look, I'm not a basketball coach, so I'm just looking at the numbers analytically. The profiles of the teams I normally see that play like this, they either slow the tempo down, which Indiana's gone the opposite direction. They've actually gotten faster this year. If they're not shooting threes, they're getting a lot of rebounds. They're not doing that, and they're also not converting from the free throw line. So I'm actually surprised all of those things are happening in tandem with each other, and they feel like they've all had the chance to get better, but haven't over the course of the last month or so.
So the one thing I've kind of been beating the drum on recently is the long twos, and I think you had some graphics on that on Twitter or X or whatever they're calling it these days recently. Is that something maybe that we're just kind of nitpicking now because the team's not winning? Is this something maybe that Indiana, obviously they did it last year a lot under Jalen Hood-Schifino, but I kind of commented in a post I did recently, just that was a okay shot last year because a lot of times Jalen Hood-Schifino would make the shot and he was an NBA level talent. And now it seems like, there's been some examples. Ryan pointed out a few in film session recently where Indiana has a wide open three and the guy fakes a shot and dribbles in a couple of feet and takes a long two, or there's a baseline out of bounds play that Indiana likes to run. And basically the goal of it is to get a long two. And, I think these are things we would obviously gloss over maybe a little bit more if the team was winning, but now they become more magnified. Do you see this as a significant problem just in terms of philosophy? You see like the extremes of like what Alabama does with the Nate Oates. It's basically you either take a three or you shoot at the rim. Whereas Indiana's shot chart, if you look at it, it's far more scattered in terms of where they're getting their looks. It doesn't seem like there's any directive to the players like, hey, this is an 18-foot jump shot. It's not a great shot. And they continue to let these things happen.
I do think it's a concern schematically. Like this feels like something that's learned. Part of it is there's a clear lack of confidence in most of Indiana's perimeter players to catch and shoot. When they catch the ball on the perimeter, it's almost as if they've been taught, look to see if there's a defender anywhere close. And if there is, shot fake, then dribble in, which used to be sound advice. I mean, that was how, but that's sound advice from an era where people hit threes at about a 30% clip or worse, where the three was not considered a high percentage shot. And it may not be high percentage, but it's much higher efficiency than dribbling in and taking an 18 or 19 footer, which is what Indiana has often chosen to do. It happens with so many different players. It happens with Trey Galloway. It happens with CJ Gunn. It happens with, the only one that really doesn't happen that much with is Mackenzie Mbaka, who does catch and shoot. But everybody else, it just feels like that is the impulse that I'm assuming has been coached into them, which is that you would rather shot fake and get a slightly more open look than take that shot from outside, which is kind of antithetical to how people are playing basketball on the perimeter in both college and the NBA these days. Now, I do think about this a lot with Woodson. And look, I think sometimes we significantly over affiliate Woodson's time in the NBA with the way that he is coaching his players. I don't know if he's actually thinking, oh, yeah, well, this worked in the NBA, so therefore it will work here. I don't know that he doesn't do that either, but I don't want to necessarily assume it. But one of the things to keep in mind about the NBA level is that everybody pretty much is a good shooter. Everybody can hit those shots consistently. That's what makes defense in the NBA so difficult, is because you can't take a moment away from almost any shooter inside of 22 feet. That's not how it works in college. Guys are not better off taking shots, when they're wide open just because they've shot faked and dribbled into it. Some guys just aren't that good at shooting. And, if you look at the percentages, even in the NBA, people have gone away from that shot fake and drive in mentality, even though you could probably more consistently hit that too, because the three is just more efficient. You're going to get more out of that possession over the course of a game. So I'll say this. I think that the problems with IU offensively go far beyond the long twos, but the long twos are a clear symptom of a much larger problem. And they, to some degree, I think just indicate a level or perhaps an approach of thinking that just doesn't quite match either the personnel or what's going to get you the most possible points possession by possession in a college basketball game these days.
Another popular criticism has been the substitution patterns, which I think have changed a little bit in recent weeks. Well, I say that, we had the Purdue game where two of Indiana's best players sat on the bench for, I think it was 12, 13 minutes, maybe more than that, of game time, when the game was seemingly getting out of hand at that point. And I kind of commented to the extent of, well, great, you saved the foul trouble, but now you're down 20. So what did you really accomplish?
Right.
And I think kind of people have kind of jumped to this comparison of, Woodson still thinks he's coaching in the NBA because he feels like he can make these wholesale line changes. And it is that way a lot of times in the NBA, where you do this, but it's also a situation where you have guys who were cream of the crop players coming off the bench and are capable of, you have a quote unquote bench unit. Those guys can come in and carry you. And a lot of times maybe you'll see those guys playing down the stretch of games and NBA games, depending on how they're playing. Not that way in college. What have you thought overall just about how the bench has been used this season and the unwillingness, I guess, at times of by Woodson to kind of deviate from it? Almost seems like a pre-planned strategy in the first half of like, all right, at this particular time, I'm going to do this. And then these guys are going to come out for this amount of time. Then I'm going to bring them back in, and then we'll kind of see where we are at halftime. And then maybe ride our guys for more time in the second half.
I mean, to some degree, I think Woodson's perspective on it is likely my most efficient lineup is going to be the lineup I start with. And I want to play that lineup as much as possible in the second half. That on paper makes sense. The problem is that this lineup has proven itself over time, and we saw the same thing the last couple of years as well. They come out and they'll play efficiently, they'll play pretty well, and then they leave because the hockey line change comes on, and it's never the same again, really, or it feels like it never gets the same again, or you're digging yourself out of a hole that number of reserves have hit. And look, it does feel NBA-ish. I think the problem, though, is that Indiana just doesn't have the bench to do it. They've not got the mix of players who can come in and effectively get anywhere close to even maintaining what goes on when the starters are in there. And while you're right, it has gotten better in that you haven't seen the wholesale changes. A lot of that's been because some guys have just gotten harder and harder to put on the floor because you're not getting the performance out of them. And so what you end up with is this situation where I think the whole idea at the beginning of the year was, well, we'll build these guys up. They'll get better. They'll learn to play as a team. That'll allow us to rest our best players simultaneously down the stretch, which we're going to need, because the longer we can keep our most efficient or our most effective lineups on the floor, the better off we'll be. In practice, that's not how it worked. And now it almost feels like, when you get multiple bench players coming in at the same time, you're just not seeing the offense or the defense run the way that they're supposed to. And that seems to create a kind of systems failure that when the starters do come back in, they can't adequately fix, because now the opposition is either scoring better or defending better. It's a mess. So to me, it's not just the lineup changes, but it's also the lack of development of some of the guys that are on the bench, and kind of how uncomfortable they look in the roles that they're playing when they are on the floor. And again, there's exceptions every game, but the macro picture kind of looks like that to me.
We talked a little bit about the bench and kind of the disappointment in some of the player development, some of the guys there. And there are examples you can point to where guys have gotten better. Obviously, Trace Jackson-Davis is a player who made a ton of gains over his 2 seasons under Mike Woodson. Malik Renew's gotten much better. Khalil Ware coming over from Oregon. Woodson was able to get a lot more out of him so far this season than what Oregon was able to. But then you look at the bench, guys like Caleb Banks and CJ Gunn. CJ Gunn this year with the worst offensive rating of anybody on the roster. 3-point shooting numbers, I think, are a little bit better than they were last year, but overall, just the offensive profile, not what you need from a player who's going to be a significant contributor. Caleb Banks has basically disappeared from the rotation these last 4 games. I think he's played a total of 13 minutes. Is it a fair criticism at this point, just some of the player development from maybe the lesser talented guys on the roster not coming along? And have you been surprised maybe at the lack of production that Indiana has gotten out of Gunn and Banks to this point?
Yeah, I'm surprised about the lack of production. I mean, these are 2 guys who were pretty well regarded. I mean, I think Caleb Banks was a top 100 recruit, and I think CJ Gunn was a top 120. I mean, and CJ Gunn's offensive rating is barely better than Christian Lander's was the last year that he was in Bloomington, which is, I mean, Christian is doing better now, but that's not really a company that you want to be keeping. And it's very odd that, because I think clearly the idea was that CJ Gunn at the very least was going to take a leap this year, and he hasn't. I don't know if, I guess, the question about player development is an interesting one, because we're really only talking about 2 guys. The rest of the roster, Anthony Walker came in as a ready-made player. Malik Renew has taken a leap. I think he's gotten significantly better. I mean, some of that is clearly his own physicality kind of, and growing into his body and being a little bit more professionalized that way. Xavier Johnson's essentially the same player that he was when he walked in the door. Trey Galloway took a bit of a leap last year and then has regressed back this year. It's, for guys going from that first year to the second year, it's just odd that they've struggled so much to find integration within the roster. And yeah, you've seen Banks not play much. You've seen Gunn go through a period where he didn't play much. It doesn't seem to really be resonating. Like, whatever the message is, the bench has not been a great motivator for development. And it's concerning because, Indiana wasn't able to add pieces in the portal that were ready-made who could just come in and start playing within a system. And Banks and Gunn in particular are struggling. And really, to some degree, even Gabe Cupps offensively seem to be struggling with plugging themselves into this offense, because it's clear that they are ancillary options at best in terms of what's going on. So, yeah, look, I think right now, the team is at 12-7. Things aren't going right. Yes, there's certainly some question marks about the development. I don't know how much of that is, well, they're not developing them properly, versus, well, maybe these guys weren't at the level they needed to be to effectively, participate at this level. And we don't know. I mean, to some degree, we've seen, like, Tamar Bates left and is having a really good offensive season at Mizzou. He wasn't a bad player last year for Indiana. He was not nearly as good as he is this year, but it wasn't like there was no development. He just never looked comfortable. So I keep wondering, is it development, or is it that, like, what the players are being plugged into that ends up being the bigger problem? And that's a system that seems to work really well for certain guys, but not necessarily work well for the whole roster.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up, and the reason I've been thinking about it more, is if you're going to build a team, a program that's successful over a long period of time, I understand that you have to bring in highly talented players, whether it be from high school or the transfer portal. But I also feel like you have to have a core number of players, maybe 2 or 3, 4, that, like, are going to stay in your program over a period of time and get better. And then you have those pieces to kind of complement whatever you're bringing in every year. And the reason, these two kind of come to mind is, let's say it doesn't work out with them and all of a sudden they're gone after this season. Like, what young players do you have kind of in your program that you point to that you've kind of brought up over a course of time and made better, and that you're going to have to count on? Are you just going to continue to bring in freshmen and roll the dice? Or are you going to completely like pivot to like, all right, every year we're going to have to get maybe a guy from the portal who has 2 years left that we feel like is already ready to plug in? I think that's kind of where it becomes concerning, because you have somewhat invested in Gunn and Banks over 2 years. And then all of a sudden, if they don't work out, it's like, all right, you're going to start right back over. You look at the recruiting class, there's one guy coming in. I just think it leaves a lot of potential holes to fill long term if you cannot identify properly. And I know CJ Gunn was originally an Archie Miller recruit, but Caleb Banks was somebody that Indiana recruited. I'm not saying he needed to be a guy that was averaging 8 or 10 points a game, but I feel like midway through someone's sophomore season, you should at least be able to get a reasonable level of play from somebody where you feel comfortable playing them 8 to 12 minutes. And right now he's basically just disappeared from the rotation.
I agree with all of that. And again, I don't know for sure if it's a problem with the coaching staff not developing guys right, or if it's more of a recruiting issue with, are you properly evaluating a player that will work in your system? The one thing I keep thinking about, though, is that this has been a longstanding issue with IU basketball.
Yes.
I mean, go back to the Archie Miller era. I mean, think about all the guys that came in that never really got close to where you wanted them to get to in terms of contributions, even in their sophomore year. I mean, Armand Franklin was better his sophomore year than his freshman year, but he didn't hit the heights people thought that he was going to. Rob Finney never really developed. Jordan Geronimo never really developed.
Demezy Anderson,
Logan Duncombe barely played and then transferred. I mean, you've got this long list of misses, or guys that maybe weren't technically misses, but never elevated to a level where they could be consistent contributors. Christian Lander goes into that category, certainly. I mean, this is a lot of strikes and not a lot of contact made. You throw Tamar Bates in the mix. You think about who are the success stories. Trace Jackson Davis, who you mentioned. Trey Galloway, relatively speaking, is a success story in that he's at least a starter and a regular contributor. He's clearly not like a first or second option, but I don't know that he was ever expected to be. Race Thompson was kind of a success, but injuries kind of never let him get to the level that you might have thought he could get to. And then you got Malik Renew, and everybody else has either come in from outside, whether it's Miller Kopp or Xavier Johnson or Michael Durr, or whatever, or they've left and then had more success elsewhere, which I think we're kind of seeing this year with Tamar Bates. So that's where, is it just bad luck? Is it bad scouting and recruiting? Or is it a developmental issue? If it is, then it really is something that stretches back through not just the Woodson era, but into the Archie Miller era and even into the Tom Crean era to some degree. So it's frustrating, Alex. It really is, because I think one of the things IU fans love the most is watching players get recruited, contribute a little, develop, and become these 3 or 4 year players that really make a difference and become beloved within the fan base. And there just haven't been very many of those people that have successfully navigated that. And I am at a loss sometimes to explain why, because it's not isolated to one single coach.
Another name you didn't bring up still on this current roster, Anthony Leal, who was a Mr. Basketball in Indiana. And, obviously there was, I think, at least a baseline level of expectation that he would be able to bring some shooting off the bench. And this year, there's been like a couple times where they've played him, but obviously there's not the confidence from the coaching staff that he's a part of the plan of what they want to do on the court. So he's just been kind of another guy that was relative. I think sometimes we get too caught up in the recruiting rankings and we look at a guy and say, all right, somebody's ranked 25th, or they should come in and be a starter right away. This guy's 150 and he, is going to take some time to develop. I mean, look at Wisconsin's team this year. They have a freshman who was, I think, ranked 225th. That's coming off their bench. Had mostly mid-major offers, and they don't like to play a ton of freshmen, but it seems like some of these other programs maybe do a little bit better job of evaluating these under the radar guys, or guys maybe ranked a little bit lower that can that can come in and make an impact. Just an observation. Obviously, there's time to kind of change the narrative, but I think as you said, it was frustrating. I think you can look around to a lot of the more successful programs in the Big Ten, and like Purdue is a great example. They may not be producing a ton of pros, but I mean, look at their two sophomores, Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith. I mean, how much do their rankings differ from what Indiana's sophomores are? And I know it's a totally different situation, totally different coach, totally different system, but I think that's the kind of thing that people look at and say, why isn't this happening with Indiana's roster?
It's funny. Anthony Leal was higher rated in the composite rankings than Trey Galloway was.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, so this is it. I don't think that it's an unfair question to look at this and say, well, why isn't Indiana having more success? I think part of the issue, and people bring up Wisconsin a lot, Wisconsin does a lot more with less. Purdue, as you mentioned, does a lot more with less. And people don't want to hear this, but like both of those programs have established very effective systems that they can bring players in, they can plug them in at the time that they're ready to be plugged in, and that allows for a little more of an organic growth curve because they've had stability. And it's not, and what's interesting is that these programs aren't necessarily like great every single year. I mean, people forget, but right. Purdue was not going to make the NCAA tournament during the COVID year. Like Indiana was, and they were not. Wisconsin, I mean, there was, what was it? I think it was last year. They didn't make
NIT.
the NCAA tournament. Yeah. But because they've had this kind of overarching consistent success, they don't freak about a bad season nearly as much as IU fans do. And I'm not saying IU fans shouldn't, because Indiana hasn't had that. But what it's led to is, and I think, an excessive amount of pressure on players to perform early. And when that doesn't happen, it seems to do something negative to their confidence levels that makes it hard for them to contribute effectively down the line. And when that gets added into coaching changes, when you've had 3 coaching changes in a 5-year span, and you're trying a completely different system, and now you're plugging in players from outside, I look at Woodson and his staff, and I'm like, well, yes, they need to develop the 3 stars and the lower range 4 stars. That's going to be the core of your program. But we're sitting here and we're disappointed in IU basketball because they're 12-7 and they're going to likely miss the NCAA tournament. It's like there's such a pressure to win now that, I think a lot of coaches feel like they can't just roll a younger team out there, let them take their lumps, and figure out a way to get them playing in a coherent system, because the systems themselves haven't looked that good. So it's like, hardcore committing to Archie Miller's, pack line defense and whatever offensive system he was trying to run just didn't seem to be yielding the results. And now you've got this situation with Woodson where they've had to fill so many holes on the roster that it's not really leading to a lot of great development with some of the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th players on the bench. It's a tough spot. And it just kind of underlines how tumultuous and ultimately, I think, disappointing this last 25 years of IU basketball has been, because this has been the cycle over and over and over again.
So with one observation, one thing that I've also been hearing from fans, and obviously, with the Back Home Network and everything you guys do over there, you kind of have a passionate community too, and I'm sure you're interacting with fans all the time. But you mentioned this system at Purdue and the system at Wisconsin. Like, we know what the system is. I think with Indiana, the question that some people have is, what is the system in terms of how Mike Woodson expects to succeed in the long term? And also, the other thing that it's just kind of, I think, frustrating for a lot of fans, and I've been the one that's asked some of these questions in press conferences. It's kind of like, okay, like, all right, today, I'm not sure I'm going to ask this exact question, but I've asked it after the Auburn game and other games. It's like, all right, you had this bad loss. Like, what are you doing to kind of remedy the situation, or what do you focus on? What do you work on? And for whatever reason, and I think there was some of this obviously with Archie Miller and Tom Crean, but Woodson doesn't really want to articulate or kind of share like what he's working on, what he's trying to emphasize to his team. It's just, it's kind of like, all right, we just got to go back to work. And I think it's okay to say that when you're being successful, but when you're not, that's not going to really get fly with the Indiana fans, because, there's thousands of people that are going to go watch these press conference recordings that they're dissecting and reading into every word that's said. Even with the radio show the other night, there was a couple of comments that Woodson made, and I tweeted them out, and people are like responding to them immediately. Like, what does this mean? What is he saying here? How important is it? Do you think, or maybe he just doesn't view it as a priority, to be able to kind of articulate to the fan base, like, this is kind of what we want to do in terms of our program. This is how we're going to get there. And these are the kind of the steps that we're doing to like remedy this within the season. Even if the season isn't salvageable, is it fair to ask that a coach kind of explains like what we're trying to do to get better?
I've watched a lot of these Woodson press conferences. I've read his responses. I've tried to listen to the tone of voice. I think Woodson just doesn't place much of a premium at all on communicating his thoughts. I think he just says what's on his mind. I don't think he puts a lot of thought into it ahead of time. Like, I'd love it if he was just screwing with folks like you in the press, or just screwing with the fans, and but I don't think that's what's happening. Ultimately, it's kind of the interesting paradox with a guy like Bob Knight, who everybody assumed was like that all the time. Everybody assumed that Knight was like, well, who the hell are you to question what I'm doing? People forget Bob Knight, before IU games, used to do a 30-minute television show with a whiteboard where he would like draw up plays and talk about like, here's what we're trying to do offensively. Here's what we're trying to do defensively.
Right.
Here's what players weren't doing well or what they did well in the last game. Like, Knight, it's such an underrated aspect of the relationship that Knight had with the fans, is that he valued them learning about the game of basketball and seeing what he was trying to do out on the floor. I think Woodson, having coached in the NBA for so long, you can't do that in the NBA, because the fans generally aren't capable, and maybe they are a little bit now, but certainly historically, we're not capable of understanding the intricate aspects of coaching basketball, and weren't that interested in them anyway. They were interested in the players. They were interested in the drama and the storylines. That's basically how the NBA markets itself, and that's fine. But I've always said Indiana basketball, the head coaching position, it's yes, it is a coaching role, but it is almost like papal in its need to preach to the masses what you're doing and make sure that they are on your side. Like, there is a weird, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but it's a weird, almost quasi-religious aspect for IU basketball fans, particularly ones that are in the southern half of Indiana. And you see the same thing with Kentucky, where John Calipari's gotten in the biggest trouble with Kentucky fans, is treating it like it's just professional basketball, and not treating it like there is a cultural, like a sociocultural aspect to being a Kentucky basketball fan and being the coach who is talking about those things. And so it's one of the reasons why Tom Crean eventually shrank out of the spotlight, because I think he was uncomfortable with that, and I get that. And Crean also never wanted to have to answer questions about why he did X, Y, or Z. He got really defensive in those press conferences. Miller never was really able to articulate what they were doing and why it wasn't working. And I think for Woodson, it kind of feels the same way to some degree, where I think Woodson looks at it and says, in my head, in my heart, I feel like what we're doing will work if I can get the guys to just execute it properly. I think that there's a lot of question marks about whether that's actually accurate, but I do think that's what he believes. And I think that in his mind, he looks at it and says, if I try to change a bunch of things, like I can change little things, I can change sub patterns, or I can tell Mackenzie Mbako to catch and shoot more. But changing anything big right now, even in a bye week, is less fruitful than doubling down on what we've already tried to do, with the idea that, to borrow a phrase, he's just got to get the guys over the hump. And,
right.
and that is insanely frustrating to IU fans. It's insanely frustrating to people who are trying to understand and ask questions and then report on this. But I think that that's ultimately where a lot of these comments come from, is that place.
Yeah, two things real quick. One, just kind of clarifying what obviously from my perspective, and people that cover the team in a professional capacity, it's not that I necessarily want to know for me. It's like I'm trying to explain this to a passionate fan base of readers who are asking me questions. And so, I in turn ask questions. And that's kind of, I think it's sometimes viewed as like, oh, well, the media is out to get somebody. Well, no, the media is just doing their job in terms of trying to serve their readers. Are there things out there that are obviously clickbait and trying to bait people into saying things? Absolutely. But, in many ways, the media is a tool that, if properly utilized, can be a great resource to interact with your fans and let them kind of know what's going on. The second thing, you mentioned Crean, and just an interesting aside here. When Crean was still in Bloomington, I don't know if you remember this, and I don't know if you ever came to one of these, but there was like a media challenge type basketball thing that he would do before the season. And I can remember when things were kind of getting a little bit heated on him. It may have been after the Vonleh season, or I think that might have been exactly when it was. We had that media challenge, but before there was like this like whiteboard or film thing set up in the corner of the room, and like for 30 minutes, it clearly was not Crean's idea, because I don't think he would have ever done this if it was. He went through like film with us for like 30 minutes and was like kind of like pointing things out and like demonstrating. It was almost like he was like trying to justify to us like that he knew the game of basketball from an X's and O's perspective. And it just popped in my mind when you talked about, that him being maybe unwilling to share. And you're right. He often talked for longer and gave like more detailed responses, but it wasn't anything like descriptive or like inside baseball, like I'm going to tell you exactly what we're working on. I just think people kind of get tired after a while of hearing like we just have to go back to work. Like that's not really telling you anything.
Well, no, and you brought up a really good point, which is you can say those things when you're winning or when you're competitive. When your team is losing by large margins somewhat regularly, and I think I'm not trying to steal from my co-host, Scott Caulfield. We're going to be doing another podcast, I think, at the end of this week. But I think at this point, Woodson's got as many 15-point plus blowout losses as Archie Miller had in his whole tenure. Like when that's happening and when you're consistently going out and not playing well against top competition, you can continue on and just talk about, well, we got to do this, or got to get go back to doing these things, or we just got to get over the hump. That's not going to sit well with fans, especially Indiana fans. I mean, I think there are fan bases where the hardcores will care, and then the vast majority are probably going to be like, well, whatever. And I think sometimes for those of us who are on social media a bunch, we think that all we're getting is the hardcore fans. But these are questions that are being asked by, the average fan who's not on social media, who's just watching, and they're like, what is Woodson doing? They're reading they're reading WDRB, or they're reading Indy Star, and they're like, I don't understand these quotes. I don't understand what's being said. These don't make a lot of sense. I do think that in this particular spot, and I would recommend, for those who haven't, listen to the podcast that I did with Zach Osterman, because we talked specifically about, are the criticisms of Woodson unfair? How much of it is this team isn't good this year versus the weight of expectations and the weight of past seasons failed? And I think to some degree, you have to be cognizant of that as the IU basketball coach right now. IU fans will actually give you a very long lead if they feel like you're doing what you need to do to get the team going in the right direction. They didn't turn on Archie Miller until everybody decided that he really didn't have the answers. Woodson is in this weird zone where I think people are very appreciative of what happened last year and to a lesser extent the year before. But when you're losing by 21 at home to Purdue, when you're getting blown out by Auburn, when you're getting blown out by UConn, when you're getting blown out at Wisconsin, it's like you got to have something more to bring to the table, especially when what you're doing, as we talked about earlier, kind of runs counter to so much of what the collective wisdom around college basketball says is the most effective ways to play the game. Like you can't purposely play a somewhat antiquated style, have it not work, and not explain in more detail what you're trying to do and why you feel like it can work. That I do think is a fair criticism. But I also think, like I said at the beginning, I don't think Woodson thinks along those lines when it comes to media commentary. I just think he looks at it as a thing he has to do, not a key part of his job, and he's entitled to do that. But you're going to get criticism as a result of that if you choose that pathway.
Last thing, and it's kind of a bit of a loaded question, so I guess we'll leave it with this. Just kind of curious, like from this point forward to the end of the season, obviously the NCAA tournament is a pipe dream at this point. You look at kind of the projections. Indiana would have to reel off a crazy run here to end the season to get back in the mix or win the Big Ten tournament, which obviously not impossible, but actually for IU basketball it has been impossible since the event was started in the early 2000s. But how, I guess in your eyes, what needs to happen to, I don't want to say salvage the season, but to kind of instill some confidence that this thing's still moving in the right direction as the season goes along? I don't think anybody's under the impression that Mike Woodson's coaching for his job. Even, there's a lot of people on social media saying, well, this isn't going to work, it's time to move on. I don't think that's the solution, because Indiana has continuously changed coaches and the results haven't been any different. Mike Woodson did make the tournament his first 2 years in Bloomington. I think he deserves a chance to figure this out, and whether that be this season or next, by addressing some of these roster issues. Is there anything that can happen the rest of the year that can maybe have fans feeling better about the direction of the program moving forward, short of a miracle NCAA tournament run?
I think there's a few. Ultimately, right now, Indiana's projected on KenPom to win 4 more games in the regular season. If they actually only win 4 more games in the regular season, that's not the catastrophe that winning less than 4 would be, but that's still pretty catastrophic. So to me, I look at it as like they've got 6 home games remaining on the season. Win all 6. That would include a win at home against Wisconsin and a win at home against Michigan State. And then, the other teams are not great. I mean, it's Iowa, Penn State, Northwestern, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Michigan State. Make Assembly all a fortress. Win those games. Okay, now you've gotten yourself up to 18 wins minimum, even if you lose all the road games. You're going into the Big Ten tournament with a little bit of momentum. You're at worst 10-10 in conference, which not where Indiana wanted to be. But if you want to take the argument that this was going to be a rebuilding year, that's not the worst outcome in the world. And you've got a couple of wins against teams that are clearly NCAA tournament bound. Maybe Michigan State isn't clearly, but I think they're going to make it eventually. That would be one thing. The other would be, can you go on the road this weekend and beat Illinois? Can you play a good 40-minute basketball game? Can you go be much closer against Purdue on the road than you were? I'm not saying you have to do both, but I think you could do either or in terms of like win all your home games and show some life. That would at least, I think, reassure people that, yes, when things are going well, this system can work, and you have faith and confidence that guys can be coached in the right direction. Beyond that, look, I think the problem is that ultimately this team, even though it doesn't necessarily have the talent in the places that you would ideally want it to be, this team's plenty talented. They're more talented than they've shown, and they're more talented than an 8-12 record in the conference would indicate based upon the projections. So if you can't get above that mark, that to me does leave a lot of questions going into the offseason, because you're probably not going to be as talented next year, or the talent you're going to have is either going to be brand new to college or brand new to Bloomington. And you've already to some degree burned a lot of goodwill by not being able to integrate new pieces or go find other new pieces that would fit into this roster. Where would the level of trust be that without Khalil Ware or without, Xavier Johnson, without some of these pieces that and even Mackenzie Mbako could potentially, be somebody that leaves. Malik Renew, who knows? But what are you building around for the next year at that point? Are you looking at entirely new roster? You've only, as you said, you've only got one player committed. They didn't get the Boogie Fland recruitment, and there's not really another guard on the horizon in recruiting where you're like, wow, that's the next Indiana guard. That's daunting for an IU fan who follows the program closely and is like, if we look like this year, you're banking on roster construction at a much higher level than happened last cycle. And you're also to some degree banking on a strategic shift to a different style of basketball potentially when the coach has shown that this is essentially how he's going to play for 3 seasons running. That sounds very pessimistic. I don't want it to sound too pessimistic, but I think those will be the questions. And it's not to say that Woodson and his staff can't answer them effectively. It's not to say that maybe this was just a season where everything got away and you get back on track. We've certainly seen other programs, North Carolina, Villanova, so on and so forth, that have had similar issues. But it really is a concern. And I don't know, at this point on the 25th of January, it's hard for me to confidently say this is the direction Indiana is going to go, and it's going to put them in a better spot than they are right now. That's where the rest of the season really matters, because if they can't play hard and well and win half the remaining games that they have on the schedule, like, where is that wellspring of desire going to come for them next year?
Absolutely. And one thing I do know is we're going to have plenty of things to talk about on our respective shows in the next couple of months and leading into the transfer portal season. It's almost like a second season on top of the basketball season. I know it's going to be a hectic time, and I think in many ways it's kind of enhanced, at least from a coverage perspective for us, the product of college basketball. Now that we have this window where of all this player movement, you can argue whether it's good for the sport or not, but from a podcasting and content production standpoint, it's definitely a positive.
Man, we used to just, you get to the second week, April, kind of kick back, relax a little bit. Now it's like you don't have a roster set until the beginning of June. So yes, we get more content right at the time when perhaps we'd all like to just kind of take a step back.
Exactly.
Like, I don't know if I really want to keep talking about IU basketball, because I will say, the sad thing is, as passionate as this fan base got in February and early March of last year, there's a lot of apathy. There's a lot of concern. There's just a lot of shrugging your shoulders like, well, here we go again, that I'm seeing out of fans. And I hate to see that, because, man, right. Indiana basketball, to get back to its base, really needs a couple of years, like 3-4 years in a row, where people aren't having existential questions about the program. That you just need stuff to go right. I can't remember the last multi-year stretch. I mean, even in the Crean era, you never got more than 2 consecutive seasons where things felt like they were going well. That is a huge psychological burden that, unfortunately, I think a lot of fans bring into the mix, and it makes it, yes, there's a lot to cover, but there's always this tinge of unhappiness, it feels like, with the coverage, and that's not good for business. Absolutely.
Well, Galen, thanks for the time. Always good to talk to you. Obviously, if you're not subscribed to CrimsonCast, make sure you go do that. Galen and Scott do a terrific job. Also, all of the shows on the Back Home Network, bringing you tremendous coverage. Galen, thanks for the time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex. You too.
We'll be back next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Indiana, obviously, at Illinois this weekend, and then we'll host Iowa early next week. So if not a chance for a win Saturday, definitely a chance early next week at Assembly Hall for a win against the Iowa team not playing particularly well right now. If you enjoy the show, as always, please leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.